registrar tries to not have any more duplicate times for finals for students. So they wait to see who has signed up finally for the classes, and so they wait in the middle of the quarter. So we'll try to check that out and send it out soon, but it's roughly the exam week, the middle of the exam week, and probably tentative time is a little later, I think, on Wednesday of the exam week, which is the time you tentatively sent me, I think.
Yes.
Okay, so we're still working on it, checking with the registrar to try to send that out as soon as we know. Okay. What we have for today is, especially in terms of the readings, is coming over some of the things that we haven't covered in the last a bit for week 7 still on the syllabus, and then week 8, which is now, but week 8 officially says economic development impacts. But this is a relatively weak, slim section because this has been the whole course. That is the main point of the first 5 sections that we covered in the first half of the course, was what are the big theories, the big perspectives of where and how this works. Is it markets? Is it leadership? Is it these perspectives are really the big drivers, which are still in some way a serious kind of framework, which a number of people are still talking about actively as social scientists, as policymakers, as active citizens, and so forth. What I'm going to talk about today is more things leading into this way of talking about economic development. We can talk about more about past impacts that were widely seen in a different way in the past. And so that's mostly what I'm talking about today, is looking at shifting alternative perspectives, which are still out there. People are still, especially right now after this election with Trump and Harris, debates about what should the general Democratic Party change to, and we have this clear kind of conflict there, as well as, of course, what specifically will Trump do, and then what will others back him among both the Republicans and the Democrats, of course. Okay, so in each period, people are more especially conscious of what's new, it's different, it's changing, and clearly that's true. But what our take on that is to say, how can we have a little more leverage to understand something like that? And the normal way is to look at changes of past theories, but the second related thing, which we saw illustrated most explicitly in the City Money chapter, when we have set up models of regressions which showed where and why the power of a different model changed before the late 60s, during the late 60s when the counterculture sort of came in, and then after the late 60s into the 70s and 80s and so forth. And we are now today living with part of the counterculture. That's the background of diversity, we can say. I mean, diversity is the hot list of African Americans, women, etc. now. But what I'm going to do now is to add a few other perspectives, which are both theories and ideological, or let's say political, programmatic perspectives, which interpenetrate these. And I'll explicitly go back to one of the most important, which is Marx. Marx himself went to Berlin and was a student of Hegel. Okay, Hegel, when Marx finished his studies, he joined most of his recent students of Hegel, and they were the so-called young Hegelians. And what did they study? Religion, because religion is what was a distilled central framework, an underlying perspective which linked with some of the historical periods which Hegel had used. And so I don't want to simplify, but what Marx himself would say, after he let me just go forward a little bit. So right after Hegel, Marx was struggling with this himself, and he made notes to himself. These were unpublished until the 1930s, when these were published by the Foreign Languages Publishing House in Moscow. So the Russians had this until the 1930s, and they brought it out. And what that showed is the struggles of the young Marx going from Hegel toward what Engels gave the term historical materialism. Okay, so the way they would sometimes explain that in less than one sentence is that we turned Hegel upside down. And so upside down in the sense that if you define Hegel as ideas dominating and explaining and interpreting the material, then that's one perspective. And what Marx would say is we're doing the opposite. We're using the material to explain the ideas. Okay, so in a sense, this went through much of the late 19th and 20th century. This changed with Weber through the 20th century, but especially in the 21st century, we've now got lots of theories, lots of different perspectives, and they're more eclectic combinations of these, like the label in the economics department here and what is known for the well-known Chicago boys as they were defined by the critics in Chile of Milton Friedman. The Chicago boys are no longer doing what they did then, and there some are, others are doing something else. But another outstanding wild one-word summary was Freakonomics, a best-selling book by Steve Alpin, who's here, professor of economics. What was his big idea? Was it material, historical material? Was it materialistic? No. What was the big idea of Freakonomics? You guys know this? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, is this circulating among those? Because several of you are economics majors.
I've heard a lot about the book itself, but I don't actually know what the content of it is.
Okay, that's what probably 97%. I don't know what percent. A lot of the economic students will say the same thing.
I think there are a couple experiments that he does, though, right? Like human experiments throughout, or maybe not.
Yes, but
that's the extent of my knowledge.
Okay.
Wasn't it kind of like just applying like classic economic analysis to just like different, like kind of what he was saying, like different experience or like different things that you wouldn't conventionally apply it to? I haven't read it either, but
okay. Well, yes, I mean that's a clear statement of it, but I would say more generally, the person who really brought that to this economics department was Gary Becker. So we have the period from Stigler and Becker, from Stigler and Friedman up to Gary Becker when he came back from Columbia in must have been, I was going to workshops at the time, of economics workshops. And when Becker came back, clearly he came back as a young hero who would really essentially redefine not only this department but the whole discipline of economics to expand what it would study. Not only the dependent variables, which is to say, what should we explain? And so Becker wrote papers on buzz, marriage, happiness, voting, all kinds of things which used to be political science or sociology or anthropology or something else, but economists didn't write about this. Second, he then would introduce not simply, as Marx, if you will, had done, say, rich or poor or material differences, but is the department more generally in that period. In his PhD, Becker chose the topic which was really called education, the economics of education, and he gave it the label of human capital. So instead of having it just be that education, we call it human capital. Then we can analyze education as something like capital, which in the theory of neoclassical economics can still look at in some of the same kinds of ways in which capital is used, but instead recognize that capital is not just money. It can be what's in people's, especially what he stressed was in their heads. And education, with the distilled critical part of what's in their heads, is how they think more creatively and more innovatively and do things differently, especially if you take I've already put on the board, it's in a couple of my books which are here. If we take Alfred Marshall into the 19th century, we have land, labor, management as be the classic factors of production. So production was the focus, and these factors were land, labor, capital, and management were those classic factors. With Becker talking about human capital, one could then say, how can we use land and labor and management more efficiently and so maybe there's not more capital or more land, but it can be used more efficiently in more creative ways. And that was in a sense the addition of human capital. Other people in sociology and elsewhere use the term social capital, and they took Becker's term, not only the one word, the two words, but the idea of taking the concept of capital from economic theorizing and apply it to things like voluntary association. So that's the core idea for a lot of political science, for instance, especially Robert Putnam. So Putnam took the theory from Tocqueville, which is really civic associations, but he used the label for this, the more general label of social capital. And so did James Coleman, who was here, an educationalist sociologist, and probably the leading sociologist in sociology at the time. So they were using these kinds of ideas, and Becker, Coleman, I we're involved in a workshop together. I ran with Becker when we were training for marathon and so forth, stuff like that. And I said to Becker, you know what you're doing is sociology. Why don't you become could we get you a joint appointment in sociology? And so he thought about it, and he said yes. Okay, so Coleman, so the others were simultaneously going further, and so I asked the question of what is Freakonomics, or what's the book that's not only, I mean, what your overall summary is good, and there's a continuing New York Times radio commentary, etc., by his co-author, which touches on all kinds of broadly economic kinds of phenomena. And so I'll just mention briefly, he was thinking about, he's a specialist in crime. It's his background at MIT. So he then said, why is crime going down since the late 60s? And lots of people were saying, we must have been tougher, we must have had tougher laws. That was one. Another was, the old one, simple materialist interpretation was, poor people commit more crimes. Poor people steal the money from rich people. Okay, that explains a little bit, but not that much, especially when you look at, and then people introduce race, and so some African Americans steal more money, and then Trump when Trump first ran for I won't go any further, but the simple labels are there. It was a clearly innovative suggestion of an economist to scout around further and to find out that drugstores started selling contraceptives at about the same time, but a little bit before the crime went down. He got more data by different counties or states or local regions, and so with more data he found, hey, if contraceptives became more widely available poorer women would be more conscious about being able to simply get contraceptives. You don't need to have an abortion law. You could simply manage to get a pill and have contraceptives before getting pregnant, and therefore, instead of having an unwanted or unintended child, you had a drop in the birth rate among lower income and especially African American women. And then Orlando Patterson, among others, is a Jamaican study, very conscious of race, basically had 4 different types of where now this interacted with class and income, but basically this was distinctly so for low-income African American women, and that they then got along well with their daughters, but not with their sons. And so if they didn't get along with their sons, and they didn't like to have these sons, they went into crime. That was the crude interpretation. Not crude. That is, it's an unusual combination of factors, especially to come from a multidisciplinary kind of perspective, which is not what at all you may have traditionally thought of as economics. Okay, so I'm simply pointing to that to simply say, not that we are studying all of those details of contraception so much as I'm saying it's a kind of social, we can loosely call this a social variable, a social characteristic, which is not clearly materialism, economic materialism in the way that Engels or Marx talked about it. When Marx took the earlier from him Adam Smith theories of the market, the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith had how many classes were in his book? 1, 2, 3?
3.
What were they? Yes, that's the right question. Right answer. That's the right answer.
There's I know there's a French term, right? Starts with B. Yeah.
Not originally in Smith. It was simpler, just simple old English.
Like the consumer class?
No, that's much later on. Okay. People who had capital and industrial activities, and so the management, that is the capitalists, the workers who worked and who did not own the capital or the industry, and third, which got dropped by Marx, were farmers or agricultural industrialists, big or small. They got bigger and bigger in Ireland and so forth. But the point was, Marx, as a student of Hegel, liked dichotomies. And there are a lot of work which show later on that psychologists show that if you just have 2, a black and a white, it's easier to convince people than if you have, well, there are 3 different classes and they each have different dynamics. Well, that's social science, but that's not as easy to show. So maybe Marx dropped the agriculture, and and so the evidence for this became more clear in the 1930s, because you now can read this 1936-37 book called Essays of, it was the year when he wrote most of these essays, and it's what's filled with are hatred, sort of critical stuff. How the English poets, these people talk about flowers, birds, poetry that love the countryside and the little villages. This ain't what we really ought to be focused on. This can take the hearts away of the workers from the real bits of life, the conflict of the capital and the worker. Capital and the worker. Okay, what has happened since then is later on people have said, well, are there more agricultural people? Well, still in a few countries of the world there's still a fair number. But in the mid-19th century there were a lot in most countries of the world. By the end of the 20th century, agriculture has gone way down, 5%, 3%, 8%, something, very low. But we have an explosion. There was another German named Ralph Dahrendorf, who was director of the London School of Economics for a while. And he had a new theory which said, any conflict group is a class. And so the guy who was the leader for a while in the college, the UC College, of how we should teach social science, and especially the power section, but others, was class is any conflict group, including cigarette smokers. Cigarette smokers, people who like it, people who don't, that's class conflict. Okay, that, I would say, and many others would say, that's social groups, social variables, the same as is contraception, but it's not quite a normal Marxist approach. So the way Marx used the term class. Okay, so this, and I introduced this simply because the battles pro and con with Marx interpenetrate many of these two sections. The first, and so I'll go through a couple of these more briefly, but I've given you, in a sense, the big picture, and it's sort of how can we handle these things, which maybe empirically, if we look more closely, we can't have a whole social science which is just about contraception or just about birds or just about flowers, but what can we do that's a little more general than just calling it the material? That's too simple. Okay, so what we have is, and I'll give some examples here. In the I give you examples last time. The Rosdell example of the context of radical populism in U.S. cities. And so I mention this because of the people in the headlines these days, this week, 2 weeks or so, include some of the former mayors of cities called progressive cities, like Burlington, Vermont, Irvine, California, when they wanted to have the environment being a central theme of our, especially local politics and now national politics. But when they did that, introducing the environment, 20 years later, when the program which candidate Harris failed on, in terms of the election a couple of weeks ago, Bernard Sanders, former mayor of Burlington, Vermont, said, if we forget the workers, the worker will give up us. And that's what's happened. And we should redirect the Democratic Party to the worker. So in this sense, this is the same kind of discussion that Marx, etc., had through the 19th century. Okay, the push on. Local economic. I was interested in very much in where and how these things worked, and in the student in the 60s and 70s and so forth. And I worked in different. I tried to get a visa to work in East Germany so I could see how Marxism worked in East Germany, because I knew German. They wouldn't give me a visa. So I managed, I didn't know how to speak Czech or Hungarian or whatever. So I learned about the French in West Africa, and I didn't have a job. So I went to French West Africa, to Dakar, got to know the people in Dakar. We're going to fly back to the only university there in West Africa, was Guinea. And Guinea was the most Marxist country in Africa at the time. And they'd had a meeting of all the African countries to organize like the United States of America, but and make a United States of Africa. And the people in Guinea said, and of course, we should be linked with Marxism. And so then the people who then were coming back from South Africa, Southern Rhodesia, they came back and they spent a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks in Guinea and talked with each other. And so I was there. So I showed up. I was in a cafe with the Guineans, and a guy came in and he said, "Anybody here speak English?" I said, "Yeah, I speak English." So we don't have a single translator, interpreter in the whole country. We'll give you a job. I said, "Okay." So I got a job. and I was translator with the president of the country, the president of, I mean, it was unbelievable. You know, like that. You know, and I had no, I mean, under, you know, and I was in my 20s, early 20s. Okay, so the themes that we then, so I won't try to go to detail except to say that my point was what I was trying to do, and what you can see in some of these readings happening in writing and by the authors that are here, are where and how to not, how's the big theory about Hegel work, the big theory about Marx, and then how does Marxism work in practice? How does it work in China right now? That's a tough. In Russia, they're more or less, most of the Russians say, you don't have communism anymore. We're not Marxists anymore. In China, you still have a strong Communist Party, and you have a central committee of the Communist Party that put on their vitas, you know, that they, you know, they're members and they write presentations that, and 10, 15 years ago, these were major policy statements. They also, for many years, had, we want to have growth of, say, 8%, 12%, 14%. They had a huge economic growth, and it was done successfully. The Chinese had fantastic economic growth from Mao until about 6 years ago. Then they dropped. They were so successful. They had a much economic growth in China. They dropped the statement that our economic growth should be X% and left it out. And instead, in 5 places, 6 places, they called the term scene. It's called now created. And this is really domestic social issues in policy, even in an officially communist-led country. Okay, so this kind of change, and scenes in this sense, we could say, is not simply Hegel, it's not simply Marx, it's not simply Weber, it's all of these and more, including architecture and physical and money, but also the aesthetics and what's morality in the sense of what's good or bad, and where these have meaning in a moral sense, which will lead people to turn out and vote against it, or burn down houses, or bomb each other, or fight wars in Israel and Ukraine. Okay, in this sense, these are labels which are important to know and talk about right now, even if the meaning of the concept Marxist and communist is changing in complicated ways. So let me flip back even earlier and say, what are some of the other themes? And these are in the ends of this section here, such as the chapter by Norman Walzer termed local economic development. This was mostly local, urban economic development policies and where and why they varied. This is the first book around which had really been done on the local policies and where and why they were different, especially including Eastern Europe. And then, okay, so let me simply go from there onward and say, well, I'll say that he was there, and our project was really taking off with the fiscal, our project before Scenes was called Fiscal Austerity and Urban Innovation. It took off soon after 1989. And 1989 was when the Berlin Wall went down, and we had organized a conference a year before in Warsaw. So we held it, and we had lots of people who showed up from many different disciplines who wanted to study local dynamics with people from the West who now could collaborate with people from Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, and so forth. And they did. And so we had a number of, we had several books, but the most economic one is the one I'm mentioning there. But what we then did was to not only have big theories about, how do we define class, but should the buses system be private or public? Should the schools be public or private? A mixture? These things were actively being debated in the Czech Republic, within Warsaw and so forth, and they still are. And in a sense, we're getting this with Trump right now. I mean, Trump is saying, let's abolish education for the national government. That's a hot issue right now. And so where and how, but I mean, Trump is still, it says it's big stuff now, but compared to what the East Europeans did and what the Russians did after 1989 was much, much bigger. Okay, so we were in the middle of that with these discussions and debates and trying to then, what evidence, what can we do to try to get evidence which would be a better way to provide water or electricity or public transit or housing, etc. Okay, so these are some of the things which are the background for these readings here. Okay, let's push on to the next section briefly for an overview. It's called Patterns of Urban Growth and Decline and Ethnic Relations. These are in italics because they're not really quite as serious. They used to be some of the special field exam for the PhD program in sociology. That's been dropped, but the point is these are still classics in the sense that it's good for your general education at least to know a little bit about it, and maybe it'll be not much more than you've heard, but I'll say just a few things. First book is called Urban Patterns, and the names, just to give you three big names: Ernest Burgess, The Growth of the City. This comes from a book called The City, which was by Burgess and one others. And its theory. What was the theory? What was the big idea? This was the beginning of urban sociology in the world, right here. And what did they? And they looked at Chicago. They went out. Students went out. Did lots of BAs, MA, PhDs in Chicago neighborhoods. What did they look for? Two things: description. One was really journalism, journalistic stuff, and the second was bits of Darwin's environmentalism, Darwin's evolutionary theories of the adaptation of animals, including human beings, but they really was written, there's no mind, there's no consciousness, and there's no thinking or iPhones or things like that as part of the part of the theory. Homer Hoyt extended this a little bit further, and so he added streets and transit, railroads, things like that. And those would raise the price of land instead of being simply the sort of normal distribution that the center of the city ought to cost the most to buy land or to rent a building or to build a building. Okay, these were the core ideas of the 1920s. Dudley Duncan has a paper called From Social System to Ecosystem, but basically he basically said he was trying to continue the same perspective of ecosystem, and the labels, concepts were invasion, succession, domination, and they were processes which applied to herds and animals, and they tried to use them for neighborhoods. The revolution against this was a paper by Walter Fiery, and this was called Sentiment and Symbolism as Ecological Variables. He was fighting with Burgess and okay. He was bringing in something from Harvard, but it wasn't altogether clear right at that point. This was beginning to be seriously discussed, but nevertheless, let me just run through the other names. Louis Wirth in the 30s called Urbanism as a Way of Life, highly cited paper. A lot of the core ideas were really in the next paper by Georg Simmel, The Metropolis and Mental Life. They both had an idea, which was that the city was a cold exchange of products, money, what you might do. Maybe you'd make a deal that you'll get a job, you'll buy a job, someone will buy something. But they went beyond that to generalize, to say the way people's lives and personalities and what they value in life is something urban. And urban, they struggle to articulate, but it was something which was different from the small town, friendly, personalistic set of relations. And the other Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, was used to distinguish these two, sort of urban or rural. Zimmel, Worth, Herbert Gams continued this, talking about urbanism and suburbanism as ways of life. That's the same label. Gans was a student of these people, and he tried to begin to move to something else, and he did. He started to study media and see that media could really, this could be different. And then bigger change still was Jane Jacobs. So all these people were Chicago, not Zimmel, but Worth, and the others were before. Jane Jacobs, we saw the video on briefly on the battle with New York and the uses of sidewalks. So the sidewalk is a way of people having personal relations. That is, the smart idea was to combine the elements of personal relationships, which were seen as part of the small town of the village, as being found within Greenwich Village, within a big city. And so that in turn has then been picked up by other people, like the listed below, Claude Fisher, Barry Wellman, and so forth. So Claude Fisher's two papers here talks. That now we're getting, after World War II, we're getting efforts to combine these, and we just finished a book that was published last week. It's coming out. It's coming out in Chinese. It is out in Chinese, but we're adapting it into English. What it does is and the Chinese said, the Chinese are still reading a lot of books called the Chicago School of Sociology and urban, and the urban work, and so they're reading the old stuff. They said, why don't we bring out a book called Scenes and the New Chicago School? I said, okay, fine. So they did, and it's now done by two of the leading scenes people there, Wu Jun and Tom Wo, and then Dan Silver and I add some stuff as well. And what I tried to add was, who were the transitional figures from the old to the new? And I mentioned a little bit Herbert Gams. Another one is Claude Fisher. That really comes later on. But the person who was there at the time was Edward Shills, S-H-I-L-S. Shills was a poor guy from a poor family, Jewish, in Philadelphia, and he came to Chicago in the 30s, and he wanted to study. He wanted to learn about social science. He was studying. He was reading what these people were writing at the time, but he said, this stuff is bad. And he studied in the University of Pennsylvania library, and he knew about people like Max Weber. He found him on himself, basically. Simultaneously, there was a guy who'd gone to Amherst and who got a PhD in Heidelberg. He got hired as a job as an economist in the sociology department, named Talcott Parsons. Okay, Talcott Parsons translated the book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Shills translated some related issues where they showed how you can combine aspects of economics with social things, because Max Weber wasn't an economic historian. So he's focusing on those issues of where do we get modern capitalism? Where do we get what goes beyond the simple, crude version of defining capitalism? So what they basically did was to say, let's take Weber's ideas about having multiple dimensions and just push it a little further. And so they started, so we saw this in the readings in the section on class status and party, and we saw this later on, but it's most visible and explicit in the individual sections on other variables, like markets or political culture. But just mentioning a couple of other names here, we have Claude Fisher combines these two of the rural and the urban by focusing on the neighborhoods. The idea of a neighborhood, classic idea in the 1920s in Chicago, but instead of being defined just by a name such as Hyde Park or Bridgeport, and saying this is based on its simple sort of the conflict among those. What Schills and the others did was to look at the content of the thinking, how did neighborhoods think and act differently. So the way that this also was being fought, and especially in the discipline of anthropology, but also sociology, but also public policy in those years, are people's values, personality, their preferences, if it's the economics term, are there differences in strength and in abilities inherited or learned? That was the big debate, 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s. And it was seen as racism if you said it's inherited. And so many of the anthropologists say, we're against racism as an ideology, and they didn't really try to say how much is something inherited or not. But this was a huge battle for the 1920s and 30s. And then beyond black and white, it became ethnic and ethnic politics. And so are the Poles different from the Hungarians? Are they different from the Thai? Are they different from the people from Bangladesh, etc.? So nations were seen as the source of ethnicity in selling, for instance, in Chicago flags. They're sold that way in Chicago. So the book by this one of probably the two leading theorists of African American ethnicity and social sociology were both here for a while, and then at Harvard. William Julius Wilson and Orlando Patterson. So Bill Wilson, most of his books were closer to Marx, and he basically said the problem is that the neighborhood I live in, called Bronzeville now, it used to be called in the 1920s, it was called Black Metropolis, or the black neighborhood. It was a black area of Chicago. That was the way it was defined. So the skin color was in a sense used instead of trying to say what's inside of people's heads. Now, is there something in the okay? So I'll simply say to simplify, two things happen in between. The biologists came up with the idea of DNA, and so that is the DNA structure of the mind is built up in ways that are partially inherited, but also changed from childhood, from birth onward, and therefore it's no longer, there's nothing to argue about, at least from a cutting edge standpoint. Don't need to argue about between inheritance and biology. They interpenetrate, and some parts are inherited, some parts are not. Okay, that's that. So when that then combined with when the first African American ran for president, again, Blake came from the South Chicago. When he was running, he created an urban advisory committee, and he included on it Bill Wilson. And Bill Wilson, working and seeing then that Obama and the President of the United States really wanted to be a black himself, wanted to somehow make policies and think about how can government help African Americans live better lives. You don't want to ignore because some diseases or some medical research could be targeted for those diseases which are stronger for African Americans, etc. So basically, he wrote a new book. He said I was wrong when I and most people said culture is only people use if they're trying to talk about the underdog. And so instead, he reversed himself, brought out a new book, toured all around the U.S., came to Chicago, and and basically said culture should be paid attention to actively, and we should analyze what is black culture, where and why does it work, and how does it lead to diseases or crime or other things, and so in that way, the truly disadvantaged, etc. This is really before that. That's not that book, but I'm pointing to this in the next book by another colleague here in this Department of Sociology was Douglas Massey at the time. At that time there were four people, three main people who were all fighting with each other simultaneously about what's black and why are blacks different. So in a sense you could say we have Gary Becker. So we had that. Bill Wilson, I'm mentioning some of the changes. Douglas Massey almost went the other way. Massey was brought up as a demographer and maintained a physical and loosely, sometimes ideologically Marxist perspective. But basically there was racism, and the title of his book was American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass. I mean, that tells your story. That the U.S. is the same as South Africa. We have an apartheid system, and we have the poor people at the bottom, and they're held down by an apartheid leadership. I mean, that's okay. There are people who still say that, and are in presidential politics and the like. This was also part of an issue, and now I'll introduce three more names just to give you a flavor of where these things then can divide it up. It's not as if it's just black and white or Marx and Hegel. We can get new dimensions get added, and so culture can be added as a component. But culture and where and how it works can be actively linked with things like social movements, and so this was going on in the roughly, this would have been the 70s and 80s especially. Southern Europeans, Italy, southern France, Spain, Greece, just considerable. Were their economies driven by land? No. Was it industry in building cars or computers? No. What's the industrial base? A huge amount of in those countries. Tourism. What do tourists want? They want to see things nice. They want to see history. They want to know about the culture and the history of those places. That's totally different than thinking in terms of a simple agricultural, farmer or an industrial capitalist and the workers. Nevertheless, the author of, who was a card-carrying member of the Spanish Communist Party, was named, who's top of the list, page 10, Manuel Castells. He sent me a copy, and it was called basically the Marxist theory of the city. So it was the strongest, outspoken, clear Marxist urban theory when it came out. And so this was, maybe this is a later date. It must have been in the 70s. However, with the Communist Party, and this is why I'm introducing these other things, which are a significant part of understanding where and why these theories get more supported or not. He left, as a number of Spaniards left Spain because it was dominated by Franco from a strong military leadership. And so he went to France. And he's very smart, and he was one of the top, he was probably, in a sense, probably the top urban sociologist. I taught the Sorbonne then, we had conferences and argued at the time, so he was then a strong Marxist. Then, 2 or 3 years later, the Spanish party said, let's create Euro-communism. Euro-communism says the environment should be important because we need beaches. We need to have pretty places for visitors, for tourism. and we should have women recognized as part of gender issues. Maybe at the beginning that they didn't talk, I'm not sure if they talked, or when they added gays, but the environment and gender, and then human rights of that people should be more treated equally if they're black or white or African or Asian or Caucasians, whatever. Everybody should be treated equal, and everybody should have equal human rights. Okay, those things got put together, and they said this is Eurocommunism. The French Communist Party said no. Lenin told us what Marx and Lenin told us what the Communist Party does, and we will do that. And they did that until 1989, when the Berlin Wall went down finally, and the Russians said we're giving it up. The Chinese said, well, we may change some of our economic system, but we're not gonna give up the Communist Party. And so this big difference between the Chinese and the Russians still persists, although it's been more loose, and even with Putin. I mean, Putin is now actively backing Russian Orthodox religion, even though he was brought up as a historical materialist. Okay, another example, Michael Deere. Paper here is called The Los Angeles and the Chicago School. Okay, we had a bunch of this going on. We had a conference, a couple of conferences. We published a book. We taught a course 3 times. and I and Dennis Judd, Bill, Dick Simpson at UIC. There's a group of about 20 of us, are the people who are urban political scientists, sociologists, economists, people in foundations working with the city in Chicago and writing about these issues. And so as Chicago had created the Chicago School of Urban Work, Michael Deere, who was English, Marxist, had a job at UCLA, wrote about how let's create a Los Angeles school, because Chicago's the old stuff, and using animals, Darwin, I mean, that's always been out of date. And so he said, the modern future is the suburb. And so the suburb with cars and decentralized people is the beginnings of the Los Angeles school. Okay, so this is beginning to break up. So in a sense, when us here in the new Chicago folks said, no, we don't follow the old Chicago folks, but neither are we following this kind of a simplistic LA version of just the suburbs is the future. So we brought in culture more actively and say the rules of the game, instead of saying let's just say blocks are different or poles are different, the question are how do the things in their heads make them different, and where and how does their DNA interact with music, lyrics, with dancing, with I talked to you about gender, and lesbians may redefine Polish dancing as a way they can pretend they're, in a sense, Swedish, and then continue on the Swedish ethnic neighborhood, even if they're in no way ethnically, hereditarily Swedish. Okay, so I'm giving you ways that these dimensions have become treated more separately, and the theorists, such as us, are trying also to capture what people are doing, not to say that they necessarily have the right theory, quote unquote, but there are a lot of people right now talking about diversity. And we talked about it 20 years before in the book called The New Political Culture. We call them social issues, but it's the same thing as diversity now. The first ones are the environment, feminists, etc. So we talked about them there and said that, but instead of saying it's one or the other, as Marx said, we said we have both of these. We ought to recognize both the economic and fiscal issues and the social issues, and let's look at how they interpenetrate and how they work together. And so this is in a sense, this is the core of the new Chicago School. We just have one more reading here, which shows the continuation. Even today, there's still many American Marxists who still are using Henri Lefebvre is on the reading list, called The Specificity of the City. Lefebvre. And my first course I had in sociology was with him and a Russian guy who was there teaching in Paris. And it was called Marxism. So I listened to it and I said, this is pretty simple stuff. So I kept looking further, but at least, I can say my first course in sociology was called Marxism. And here we go. All right, I'm saying, I'm laughing in a sense that, but that's why I went to Africa. I mean, I wanted to see where and how it worked. And that is, I knew that Lefebvre was, and with the Parisian, we know the Parisian theorists, I knew they were wrong. I said, this is crazy. But I said, how do they really do it, in practice? Okay, and that's more complicated. All right, the next big section is called, as I said, economic development impacts, but I'm giving it less time deliberately because it has the same kind of big structure as I've been telling you. The two authors of the main book here are John Logan and Harvey Molich, called Urban Fortunes. And these two guys are, Harvey Molich was a student when I first came, when I first joined the faculty. He did his PhD on the neighborhood just south of Hyde Park called South Shore. And South Shore was all white, basically, in the 1920s. And in less than a decade, roughly a decade, it became all black. And how did that happen was what he tried to focus on. That is, it was not economics. It was not urban, it was on ethnicity, migration, real estate agents, things like that. It was done in a fairly descriptive, old Chicago style of describing how it, in the same way that many historians do things. His co-author was John Logan, who was a Berkeley student who was also not really Marxist. That is, both these guys. So I worked with them when they were students, and then and we created conferences together. Then, late '60s, the '70s, Marxism took off again, and then we had people like Logan and Molich writing this book. 1980. This is a second edition, I think. Yeah, this is second edition. It's the University of California Press. They had an earlier, but when they wrote this, basically when they were Marxists, and they're Marxist concepts in the different chapters. But they did include what they called something to do with the use rather than that is the use of capital, the use of products. But it wasn't. They didn't stress markets. They did stress business leadership in maximizing land value, but they did. Okay, so I'm making that point as I'm making for Manuel Castells and John Logan and Molich. The three of them worked together and they created an international association. And I was at the time president of the urban. I created, and I was president of the urban sociology section of the International Sociological Association. These three guys I knew. They came to a conference. And they said, we're going to start we disagree with what you're saying. We're going to start a new section on basically Marxist sociology, urban work. And so they did. And then 5 years later, all three of them gave up Marxism. They changed their minds. Marxism was too simple. That there were more things going on. So Castells went to Berkeley, and his main book was on new social movements, Greens, women, gays, those kinds of things, which the French could not study. Spanish, yes. The Americans, yes. Not the Spanish. Okay, so I'm simply the same thing, and so African Americans at that time then said, we don't talk about it. And even those two smart African American authors at now Harvard, both of them said material is the truth. That is, class is economically based. Ethnicity is false consciousness. They reversed themselves 20 years later. So people are, reversing. I'm simplifying a little bit, but They in their own words, they talk about how much these things did change. Castells very explicitly John Logan himself, and there are two papers on the reading list, so you can see the title of the paper was "The Character and Consequences of Growth Regimes." This is economic growth regimes. This was a widespread theory, quote unquote, of economic growth. An assessment of 20 years of research, and it basically says it's wrong. But the idea of a business growth machine is stupid. Stupid, I mean, stupid is too strong, but basically empirically incorrect and not supported. He then did two papers. One with a review of the literature, and a second was an empirical analysis of urban data to try to see how much business dominance or whatever could explain actual policies. And found it in both methodologies you got the same results. It didn't work, so he gave up the growth machine concept. Whereas by contrast, Harvey Malich went to Santa Cruz, and he was sitting there right next to the beach when they had an oil tanker that flooded and which sank and got oil all over the beautiful beaches of California, and Santa Cruz was this huge scandal. So the environmentalists of California along the coastline became very active as a social movement. That in turn led Harvey Malich to say, hey, Marx didn't say anything about dirt, oil on the sand, but it's important. Clearly it mobilized a lot of people. Okay, so we need a new theory. All right, so, but this then led to a big debate in the American Sociological Review. What's the role of Marxism here? And so this has been going, and this is still, you can see this in Bernard Sanders this week, is still there. Bernard Sanders came to the University of Chicago. He went to Brooklyn College, I think, for 1 year. And then he came to the University of Chicago for 3 years. He majored in political science, and went on. Okay. I'm running through some big changes in perspective in terms of economic development, and often redefined in a narrow, different way. Next reading, Edward Getz, Goetz, was a political scientist hired by Dianne Feinstein to be one of the lead people on environmental policy. How can we, when she was mayor, how can environmental policies be actively pursued and implemented? And San Francisco went the furthest of any of the California cities. So after this, stuff on the beaches, lots of things. So California, San Diego said we'll only have 2 skyscrapers a year because shadows will destroy the environment. Class conflict over shadows. How about that? They did. And so they had the strictest ways of holding hearings and having anybody could come to the hearing and say, I don't want to have this or that structure put up because it might have a shadow, or it might have this. It might have a bad impact on the aesthetics of the environment. Wow. Okay, so this kind of thing, Ed Getz said, this is type 2 policy and mandated benefits in economic development. So he did a little survey, and he and I then analyzed the data that he collected. And the data, he did a survey nationally. Said, do you have a local organization which is concerned about the environment? This is brand new in the era of, say, Richard Nixon. And maybe a little more than a third had these kinds of organizations, and we had a little bit about them. And I did a survey. I got the data from the Sierra Club. How many members do you have of the Sierra Club in all the congressional districts of the whole U.S.? So we analyzed these kinds of data. Then we did 5 case studies of the 5 cities that first really pursued environmental policies. And one quick example, which is to say, Los Angeles had a mayor who didn't care about the environment. They were concerned more about economic growth, jobs, whatever, and ignored environmental issues. 4 of his key people got voted out of office, council members, city council members, backing the people who ignored the environment. The mayor reversed his policy and became a strong environmentalist. Jerry Brown is governor of California roughly after. Then Jerry Brown did the same thing of changing his policy, but his was on fiscal issue. So Prop 13, when that passed, 1978, I guess it was, Jerry Brown the next day only went to the complete opposite of saying, instead of saying, I'm against, we want to, we have more money, we want to have a university, we want to have freeways, this is California. The next day, and his own father had built all that stuff as governors. His son, he said, we're going to cut by half. We will cut the property taxes of California, and they did. Okay, so fiscally conservative, socially liberal, that's the simple definition of the new political culture. And I started talking about this for 1974, with 1974 data, that my data was half the U.S. cities, more than half of the U.S. cities were cutting their budgets from 1974 on, even though the great majority of them had Democratic mayors and council members. So I'd say this to people, Democrats cutting their taxes? Absolutely no, that can't be possible. They threw tomatoes at me for 4 years. Then Prop 13 was passed, then people were going to say, wow, what are you talking about? It's just California. Then Michigan did the same thing 2 or 3 years later. Massachusetts did the same thing a year or two after that, 1980 I think it was. And then Ronald Reagan was elected. And Ronald Reagan then was given, Ronald Reagan created the taxpayers report. He was a consequence, not a cause of the tax. Margaret Thatcher, same thing. Okay, that I gave a lecture on when we talked about city money. All right, I've covered the readings up through most of those. We're at the end, so I won't say any more about Sharon Zook and Gordon Douglas. But you see the kinds of the big points I'm making. The battles over classes of what fits together, and you see how the pieces can fit together with the theories, and the theories link in turn with huge political events in life. The Proposition 13, the Berlin Wall going down, etc. I will end there, and I will chat with anybody who wants to for office hours right now afterward, and our TA will help you with anything on papers or exams. And if any of you want to email him and ask for elaboration, we will do so, but that's it for today.